If I told you that the most dangerous people aren't strangers, they're the ones who sit across from you at dinner, calling you family while counting your inheritance in their heads. Would you believe me? I didn't, not at first. Not when my dad married Linda 2 years after my mom died, and she showed up with homemade cookies and that perfect smile that never quite reached her calculating eyes. I couldn't believe that someone could weaponize grief, turn vulnerability into opportunity, treat my mother's final gift to me like an investment portfolio waiting to be raided. But the truth has a funny way of revealing itself when you stop making excuses and start paying attention. And what I discovered about my stepmother's innocent concern for my finances would have made my military drill instructors proud of how cold, strategic, and absolutely unforgiving I became. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but what they don't tell you is that justice served in a conference room with bank statements and witnesses is so much sweeter than any screaming match could ever be. She thought I was just a grieving kid, easy to manipulate, too emotional to notice the patterns. She lied every time she said she cared. Every time she pretended her questions about my money were about helping me plan for the future. Every single moment she played concerned stepmother while literally forging my signature on bank documents. I was humiliated when I first discovered the fraud alerts, shocked when I found her emails strategizing about eventually getting power of attorney if we're patient enough, and absolutely exposed to the reality that my own father had been complicit in his silence, choosing comfort over protecting what my mother died to ensure I'd have. What happened next? Then I stopped being the accommodating daughter and became something she never saw coming. Someone who understood that you don't fight manipulation with emotion. You fight it with documentation, witnesses, and the kind of cold precision that leaves no room for denial. The betrayal wasn't just about money, though, let's be clear. She cheated me out of peace in my own home, turned every family dinner into a reconnaissance mission for information about my accounts, made me second-guess my own instincts until I learned to trust the banking alerts more than my father's reassurances that I was being paranoid. But here's the secret they don't tell you about family drama. Sometimes the people who betray you aren't caught until you stop trying to save the relationship and start building a case. This is the story of how I gave my stepmom a Mother's Day gift she'll never forget, wrapped in legal documents, tied with bank statements, and presented in front of everyone she'd convinced of her benevolence. And if you've ever wondered whether karma actually exists, or if justice is just something we tell ourselves to feel better about being wronged, well, keep watching, because what I did next redefined what it means to reclaim your dignity when family becomes the enemy you never expected. I was 19 when my mother died, and I remember thinking the worst part wasn't the funeral or the empty chair at dinner. It was watching my dad try to fill the silence she left behind. He met Linda 6 months later at some work event, and honestly, I wanted him to be happy again. I really did. She seemed kind, put together, the type who'd remember your birthday and ask how your day went with that perfect, concerned expression. But there was something I couldn't quite name. Something that lived in the pauses between her smiles, like she was always calculating her next move. I told myself I was being paranoid, that grief makes you suspicious of anything new, so I buried that instinct deep and tried to play along. Linda moved in after the wedding, and suddenly everything in our house had her fingerprints on it. New curtains, rearranged furniture. Even my mom's recipes got improved with her little tweaks. She'd say things like, "Your mother would have wanted you to have a real family again." And I'd feel this knot in my stomach because who gave her the right to speak for someone she never knew? The betrayal wasn't loud or obvious. It was in the way she'd mention my savings account during casual dinner conversations, always with this tone like she was just being helpful. "Denise, have you thought about diversifying your investments?" she'd ask. And my dad would nod along like she was some financial guru instead of someone who'd never worked a day past her first marriage. I started noticing how every conversation eventually circled back to money, planning, security. Her words, not mine. The thing about manipulation is that it doesn't announce itself. It wears the mask of concern until you're too tangled up to see clearly. Linda would bring up family planning sessions where she'd suggest combining accounts for efficiency, Or she'd casually mention how my mom's life insurance, money that was mine, could be better managed if we all had access. I couldn't believe how smoothly she operated, like she'd rehearsed these lines in front of a mirror. My dad just sat there, silent, and that silence felt like its own kind of backstabbed, because wasn't he supposed to protect what my mother left for me? But I kept quiet too, watching, waiting, feeling something cold and sharp forming in my chest where trust used to live. Then came the comments about my irresponsible spending. Ironic, considering I hadn't touched that money except for tuition and rent. Linda would sigh dramatically and tell my dad, "Young people today don't understand the value of saving," while eyeing my bank statements that somehow kept appearing on the kitchen counter. She didn't have legal access, but when you live in the same house, paper trails have a way of becoming weapons. The humiliated feeling of having my financial life dissected by someone who contributed nothing to it was suffocating. But I swallowed it down. She'd even started mentioning how stressful it must be for me to manage all that money alone, offering to help with a smile that never reached her eyes. Every word was a carefully placed stone, building a bridge between her hands and my inheritance, and I was supposed to just hand over the keys and say thank you. I joined the army at 21, partly for discipline, partly to escape the suffocating atmosphere of that house where my grief had been redecorated into someone else's vision of normal. Basic training taught me something invaluable: how to observe without reacting, how to identify patterns in chaos, how to wait for the right moment instead of rushing in blind. When I came home on leave, I saw everything differently. Linda's innocent questions weren't innocent at all. They were reconnaissance missions. Her suggestions weren't helpful. They were invasive attempts to gain control over something that represented my mother's love, my independence, my future. I realized then that some battles aren't won with confrontation. They're won with strategy, patience, and documentation. So I stopped arguing, stopped defending, stopped showing any emotion that might reveal I was onto her game. I became a mirror, reflecting back polite smiles while my mind cataloged every overstepped boundary, every inappropriate question, every time she mentioned my finances like they were hers to discuss. Linda thought my silence meant compliance, that I'd finally accepted her authority over my life and my money. My dad thought I'd matured, grown past whatever teenage resentment he'd convinced himself I had. But the truth? I was gathering intelligence, preparing for something they couldn't see coming, because I'd learned that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's patient, calculated, and absolutely unforgiving when the moment finally arrives. The first real alarm bell rang on a Tuesday morning when my bank sent me a fraud alert. Someone had attempted to add themselves as a joint account holder using my social security number and forged signature. I was in Seattle at the time, 3 states away from Linda's perfectly manicured presence, which made the timing rather convenient for establishing an alibi, wouldn't you say? The bank's security team walked me through the details. The request came from my hometown, used information only someone close would know, and had been submitted with documentation that looked legitimate enough to almost pass. My hands shook as I listened, not from fear but from the crystallizing realization that this wasn't paranoia anymore. This was proof. The lied-to feeling transformed into something colder, sharper, something that demanded action instead of accommodation. I didn't call my dad immediately because I knew exactly how that conversation would go. He'd find some excuse, some explanation that painted Linda as confused or well-intentioned, rather than predatory. Instead, I called the bank back and requested copies of everything: the application, the signatures, the IP address of the computer used, timestamps, every digital breadcrumb that could trace this back to its source. They were surprisingly helpful once I mentioned potential identity theft and fraud charges, suddenly very interested in protecting their institution from liability. I learned that this wasn't even the first attempt. There'd been inquiries about my account 3 months prior, questions about beneficiaries and access rights that the bank had flagged but never escalated. Someone had been testing the waters, seeing how far they could push before triggering real security protocols. That weekend, I flew home unannounced, told my dad I had a last-minute leave, acted casual, watched Linda's face when I walked through the door without warning. She recovered quickly, all hugs and what a wonderful surprise. But I caught that microsecond of panic, the brief flash of calculation behind her eyes. Over dinner, I mentioned casually that my bank had been having technical issues with their security system, lots of false alerts about account access attempts, real pain to deal with. You know how it is. Linda's fork paused midway to her mouth, just for a heartbeat, before she recovered with some sympathetic comment about modern technology being so unreliable. My dad, oblivious as ever, launched into a story about his own bank's customer service failures. But I was watching her, cataloging every micro-expression, every tell that confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't about family or planning or care. This was about payback for a life she'd left behind, financed by someone else's grief. I started going through the house when they were out, not snooping exactly, more like conducting a lawful search of a crime scene where I happened to live. In Linda's home office, tucked behind her collection of self-help books about blended family success, I found folders. Not just any folders, but meticulously organized documentation about my financial life. Printed bank statements she shouldn't have access to, notes about my mother's life insurance policy with calculations in the margins, research about legal guardianship and financial power of attorney, even though I was well past 18. There were drafts of letters to financial advisors, inquiries about trust fund access, even a consultation receipt from a lawyer specializing in estate law. The most chilling part? She'd been building this case for 2 years, ever since she married my dad, treating my inheritance like a project with phases and milestones and projected outcomes. The cheated sensation hit me differently than I expected. Not hot and explosive, but ice cold and clarifying. She'd weaponized my dad's loneliness, my grief, our family's vulnerability, and turned it into an opportunity for financial exploitation with the patience of someone who'd done this before. I photographed everything with my phone, careful not to disturb a single paper, documenting the evidence like I'd been trained to do. Each click of the camera shutter felt like reclaiming something stolen. Not just money, but dignity, autonomy, the right to grieve my mother without someone trying to profit from her absence. I realized then that confronting her directly would be pointless. People like Linda don't admit guilt. They pivot, deflect, play victim, recruit allies. No, what I needed wasn't a conversation. What I needed was an airtight case and a public forum where her carefully constructed image would shatter under the weight of documented truth. My dad's complicity was perhaps the hardest pill to swallow, because it wasn't active participation but passive permission, which somehow felt worse. He'd seen the conversations, heard the suggestions about my money, watched Linda overstep boundary after boundary, and he'd said nothing, done nothing, chosen comfort over protection. He didn't know every detail, but he knew enough to stop it. And he chose not to. That's its own kind of infidelity, isn't it? Not cheating in the traditional sense, but betraying the fundamental contract between parent and child. That you'll stand between them and harm, even when harm comes dressed in a wedding ring and calls itself family. I found emails between them discussing Denise's situation, how to help her see reason about financial planning, how to gently guide her toward decisions that benefited their vision of the future. Reading those exchanges felt like watching my father choose sides, and I wasn't on his. That realization settled into my bones with a permanence I knew would outlast whatever resolution came next. The Army teaches you to observe before you act, to gather intelligence before you engage, to understand that emotional reactions are luxuries you can't afford in hostile territory. When I looked at Linda's escalating attempts through that lens, everything became tactical. She was an adversary running a long-term operation, and I'd been too close to see the pattern. My drill sergeant used to say, "Control your emotions or they'll control you," and I'd rolled my eyes at the time, thinking it was just tough guy rhetoric. But sitting in my childhood bedroom, staring at photos of evidence on my phone, I understood what he meant. Anger is energy, and energy without direction is just noise. Linda had been counting on noise, on me exploding, making accusations I couldn't prove. alienating my father with emotional outbursts that would paint me as unstable or ungrateful. I started applying military observation protocols to civilian life, which sounds dramatic but was surprisingly effective. Every interaction with Linda became an intelligence-gathering operation. I noted what she asked, when she asked it, who else was present, how she framed her questions, what information she was fishing for. When she'd casually mention my future plans, I'd give vague, pleasant answers while mentally cataloging that she was testing whether I intended to move away or maintain local ties. When she'd suggest family meetings about finances, I'd agree with enthusiasm while noting that she wanted witnesses to normalize her access to my private information. The shocking part wasn't that she was manipulative, I'd known that for a while, but how systematic it was, how each small request built on the previous one, creating a foundation for larger intrusions. I stopped defending my decisions or explaining my choices because explanation requires vulnerability, and vulnerability was what she'd been exploiting all along. "That's interesting, Linda," became my standard response, neutral and non-committal, giving her nothing to work with or twist into justification for her concern. My dad would look confused when I'd deflect her financial questions with polite redirection, probably wondering when I'd become so closed off, not realizing that openness had become a liability in my own home. The revenge I was planning wasn't about retaliation for its own sake. It was about restoration, restoring boundaries, restoring my right to privacy, restoring the truth about what she'd been doing while everyone assumed I was just being difficult or carrying unresolved grief about my mother. Military discipline also taught me patience, real patience. Not the teeth-gritted kind where you're secretly counting down to an explosion, but the strategic kind where you let your opponent hang themselves with their own rope. Linda was so confident in her approach, so certain that my youth and grief made me manageable, that she got sloppy. She started pushing harder, mentioning my accounts in front of extended family, suggesting to my aunt that I needed guidance with my inheritance, planting seeds of doubt about my capability to manage my own finances. Each overreach was a gift, really, because it demonstrated pattern and intent to anyone paying attention. I just had to make sure people started paying attention at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right context, where denial would be impossible and her carefully curated image would crack beyond repair. The dignity I'd felt slipping away during those early years of her presence came roaring back once I had a plan, because dignity isn't given, it's claimed. I wasn't my mother's grieving daughter anymore, passive and accommodating. I was a soldier who'd identified a threat and was neutralizing it with precision. Every smile I gave Linda became psychological warfare. Every pleasant dinner conversation, a data collection session, every family gathering an opportunity to note who she tried to recruit as flying monkeys in her campaign to access my money. She thought I'd accepted her, maybe even learned to love her as a stepmother. What she didn't know was that I'd reclassified her from family to target, and targets don't get mercy, they get accountability. I started working with a therapist during this period, not because I was falling apart, but because I needed to process the rage without letting it consume my judgment. She helped me understand that what I was feeling wasn't just anger about money, it was grief about my father's failure to protect me, fury about my mother's memory being exploited, and a deep, cutting sense of betrayal that someone could pretend to care while simultaneously plotting to control. The therapist asked once if I wanted reconciliation or justice, and I remember the certainty in my voice when I answered, justice. Because reconciliation requires good faith on both sides, and Linda had operated in bad faith from day one, wearing my mother's absence like a costume she could exploit. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is burn them with such completeness that no one can ever guilt you into crossing back. Documentation became my religion during those months. Every bank alert saved, every suspicious conversation recorded in a journal with dates and witnesses, every piece of paper photographed and backed up to 3 different cloud services. I learned that proof isn't just about having evidence, it's about having evidence that can't be dismissed, explained away, or attributed to misunderstanding. The banking fraud attempt was my cornerstone, But I needed more. Needed a pattern so clear that even my father couldn't retreat into denial or paint me as paranoid. I requested my full credit report and found inquiries from financial institutions I'd never contacted, all originating from my hometown zip code during periods when Linda knew I was away. Each unauthorized inquiry was a breadcrumb, and together they formed a trail leading straight to her calculated exploitation. I hired a forensic accountant, used part of my savings to pay someone who specialized in financial fraud and family disputes, because this had moved past personal grievance into criminal territory. She was a woman in her 50s named Margaret, who'd built a career unraveling exactly these kinds of situations, and she listened to my story with the detached professionalism of someone who'd heard worse. What she found was stunning in its scope. Linda had attempted to access not just my checking account, but my investment portfolio, my mother's life insurance trust, even the small savings bonds my grandmother had left me. There were forged signatures on 3 separate documents, attempted beneficiary changes, and inquiries to my mother's estate lawyer that he'd flagged but never reported to me directly. Every document I collected stripped away another illusion, until I realized the woman smiling at me every morning had been planning my financial erasure for years. Margaret laid it all out in a 40-page report with exhibits, timelines, and legal analysis that left no room for maybe she was just confused, or perhaps she had good intentions. The emails I'd found weren't just between Linda and my dad. She'd been corresponding with her sister about the inheritance situation, discussing strategies to help Denise see that family resources should be pooled, complaining about my stubbornness in keeping my finances separate. Her sister had encouraged her to be patient and keep building trust, because eventually she'll give you power of attorney if you play it right. Reading those exchanges felt like watching someone plan a heist in slow motion, treating my mother's final gift to me like an opportunity rather than something sacred. The karma was that she'd documented her own intentions so thoroughly, never imagining I'd find these communications, too confident in her control over the household to cover her digital tracks properly. My father's involvement was documented too, though he'd probably never admit to understanding what he was enabling. I found texts where Linda would say things like, "Talk to Denise about her finances today, she's still resistant," and he'd respond with, "Give her time, she'll come around," as if my resistance to being exploited was a character flaw I'd outgrow. There were conversations about my immaturity regarding money, discussions about what's best for the family, even a thread where they debated consulting a lawyer about whether they could challenge my mother's will based on my age at the time, despite it being legally airtight. The humiliated anger. I felt reading my own father strategize with his wife about accessing money my dead mother left specifically to me was volcanic, but I channeled it into focus, into building a case so overwhelming that emotion would be irrelevant compared to facts. I contacted my mother's estate attorney, the one who'd drafted her will and established the trust, and walked him through everything I'd discovered. He was horrified, not just at Linda's attempts, but at his own failure to notify me directly about the inquiries she'd made to his office. He pulled his files and found 3 separate instances where Linda had called, asking about trust modification procedures, claiming she was asking on behalf of the family, fishing for information about what would be required to change beneficiaries or access structures. He'd deflected because something felt off, but he'd never thought to reach out and warn me directly. That meeting was where I learned that I could pursue criminal charges for the identity theft and fraud attempts, or I could handle this civilly with legal documentation that would protect my assets permanently. The truth was, I didn't want Linda in prison. I wanted her exposed, humiliated in front of everyone she'd convinced of her benevolence, stripped of the concerned stepmother mask in a way that couldn't be denied or forgiven. The final piece came from my bank's security department, who'd been investigating the access attempts on their end. They provided sworn statements about the forgery attempts, expert analysis of the forged signatures, and IP tracking that placed the attempts at my father's house during specific times when Linda was home alone. Their head of fraud prevention told me this wasn't uncommon, second spouses attempting to access stepchildren's inheritance, especially when the biological parent is passive or easily manipulated. But it was always jarring to see it documented so starkly. He gave me a presentation-ready summary of the fraud attempts, complete with charts and timelines, the kind of material that couldn't be argued with because numbers don't lie, and digital footprints don't forget. I added it to my growing file. This mountain of evidence that represented not just Linda's betrayal, but my transformation from victim to someone who understood that self-worth sometimes means going to war for yourself, even when everyone tells you that families should forgive and forget and move on. I didn't want a screaming match in the kitchen where she'd cry and my dad would defend her, and nothing would actually change except everyone would be angrier. I wanted something formal, documented, with witnesses and legal weight, something she couldn't spin or minimize or dismiss as a misunderstanding between family members. My attorney, I'd retained one who specialized in financial elder abuse and inheritance disputes, ironic since I was the young one here, suggested a formal mediation with a financial counselor present. The genius of it was that it would look like I was trying to improve family dynamics, seeking professional help to work through our issues, when really, I was building a legal record of her misconduct in a setting where denial would be professionally documented as dishonest. Linda would think she was walking into a therapy session. What she'd actually be walking into was a deposition. The preparation was meticulous because I'd learned that you get one shot at something like this. Mess it up and people will blame you for being dramatic or vindictive. Nail it, and the truth becomes undeniable. This didn't happen overnight. It cost me sleep, money, and the illusion that family protects you by default. I worked with my attorney to organize every piece of evidence chronologically, creating a narrative that even someone with no legal background could follow. We had the bank fraud attempts with security footage timestamps, the forged documents with handwriting analysis, the email correspondence with her sister discussing strategy, my father's text messages showing passive complicity, the credit report inquiries, the estate attorney's testimony about her fishing expeditions. It was overwhelming in its completeness, the kind of case where each individual piece might be explained away, but the totality painted a picture so clear that interpretation became irrelevant. I invited extended family to what I framed as a family financial planning meeting. My aunt, my mother's brother, even Linda's sister who'd been encouraging her schemes in those emails. My attorney suggested this because personal accountability often requires public witnesses. People behave differently when their reputation is on the line in front of their social circle. Linda was thrilled initially, probably thinking this was me finally accepting her guidance, agreeing to the family resource pooling she'd been pushing for years. My dad seemed relieved, interpreting the meeting as me maturing past my trust issues about his new wife. What they didn't know was that the family financial counselor I'd hired was actually a forensic specialist who worked with fraud cases and would be presenting findings, not facilitating a feel-good session about shared values and blended family success. The week before the meeting, I moved the bulk of my liquid assets to a new account at a different bank entirely, one with enhanced security features and explicit instructions that only I could access or modify anything related to the account. I updated beneficiaries on my life insurance, revised my will despite being only 23 because I'd learned that unprotected assets are invitations for exploitation, and set up trust protections that would make my inheritance legally untouchable without a court order. My attorney filed preliminary paperwork for restraining orders on financial access, so if Linda tried anything dramatic after our meeting, the legal mechanism to stop her was already in motion. I was preparing for war while maintaining the appearance of someone naively seeking family unity, and the cognitive dissonance of it was almost amusing, almost if it weren't about my dead mother's money and my father's betrayal. I rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd stay calm when Linda inevitably tried to cry or play victim, how I'd redirect when my dad attempted to minimize or defend. My therapist helped me prepare for the emotional manipulation tactics, the "you're tearing this family apart" guilt trips, the "your mother would be so disappointed in you" weaponization of my grief, the "after everything I've done for you" reframing of exploitation as sacrifice. I wrote down every technique she might use and practiced responses that didn't engage with the emotion, but simply redirected to facts. The bank statements show otherwise. The forged signatures speak for themselves. Your emails with your sister document your intent. No room for interpretation. No invitation to debate feelings when we were talking about documented criminal activity. The night before the meeting, I barely slept, not from anxiety, but from anticipation, because I'd spent 2 years watching Linda operate with impunity while everyone told me to be grateful for her presence in my life. Tomorrow, the reclaiming would begin, not just of my money, but of my narrative, my right to define what family means and doesn't mean, my mother's memory that had been used as emotional leverage for too long. I thought about calling the whole thing off, taking the easier route of just cutting contact and moving away, but I realized that would leave her free to try this with someone else, to continue wearing that mask of benevolent stepmother, while calculating how to profit from other people's grief. Some acts of justice aren't just personal, they're preventative, warnings to anyone watching that some lines shouldn't be crossed because the consequences will be thorough, public, and permanent. The meeting room felt smaller than I'd expected. Sterile office space with a long table, neutral gray walls, the kind of setting where emotion wouldn't dominate because the environment itself demanded professionalism. Linda arrived dressed like she was going to church, all soft colors and modest jewelry, playing the role of concerned maternal figure. My dad looked uncomfortable in his suit, probably confused about why I'd requested formal attire for a family planning session. My aunt, my uncle, Linda's sister, they all filed in with varying expressions of curiosity and concern, taking seats around the table while the financial counselor set up her laptop and projector. I was calm, preternaturally so. Years of military training overriding every instinct to either flee or attack, holding myself together with the knowledge that in about 30 minutes, everything would be undeniably clear. The counselor started with pleasantries and framework, talking about blended family dynamics, the importance of financial transparency, the common challenges that arise when inheritance and new marriages intersect. Linda was nodding along, probably thinking this was vindicating her position, that we'd get to some mediated compromise where I'd agree to joint accounts or shared planning. My dad reached over and squeezed her hand, this gesture of solidarity that made my stomach turn because he still didn't understand that he'd chosen wrong. Then the counselor transitioned, her voice taking on a different tone. However, before we can discuss healthy financial planning, we need to address some documented concerns Denise has brought to my attention. She clicked to the first slide, a timeline of unauthorized access attempts to my bank accounts. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in the silence that followed. The counselor walked through each incident methodically. The fraud alert from March, the forged signature from July, the inquiry to the estate attorney in September. Linda's face went through a fascinating progression. Confusion, then recognition, then calculated concern. There must be some mistake, she started, but the counselor cut her off professionally. These are sworn statements from the bank's fraud department, Mrs. Harrison. The IP addresses traced to your home address during times when Denise was demonstrably out of state. My dad's hand dropped from Linda's. I watched him processing, his face struggling between disbelief and dawning horror. My aunt leaned forward, staring at the screen like she was reading a foreign language she was slowly beginning to translate. Then came the emails, Linda's correspondence with her sister, projected on the wall in 14-point font for everyone to read. Keep building trust. Eventually, she'll give you power of attorney if you play it right. The inheritance situation could solve everything if we're patient. Her sister turned white, looking between Linda and the screen like she could make one of them disappear through force of will. I watched Linda's mask crack in real time, the warm, concerned stepmother dissolving into something colder, more calculated. She tried to explain. They were taken out of context. I was being cruel. This was a private misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But every word she said just highlighted what the evidence had already proven. The shocking realization spreading across my father's face was almost harder to watch than Linda's exposure, because it meant he was finally seeing what I'd been trying to tell him for years. The financial counselor continued through the rest of the evidence: the credit report inquiries, the attempted beneficiary changes, the consultation with an estate lawyer about challenging my mother's will. With each revelation, Linda's defense became more desperate, shifting from denial to justification. She was only trying to help. I was too young to manage that much money responsibly. She'd been concerned about my well-being and maybe made some mistakes in how she approached it. But mistakes don't have multi-year timelines with documented intent and strategic correspondence about patience and trust building. Mistakes don't involve forgery and fraud alerts and lying to estate attorneys. The room understood this. I could see it in their faces. The shock, the disgust, the recalculation of every interaction they'd had with Linda through this new lens of understanding. My dad finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Denise, why didn't you come to me?" And there it was, the question I'd been waiting for, the one that demonstrated how completely he'd missed the point. I looked at him directly, keeping my voice level. "I tried, Dad. Every time I mentioned feeling uncomfortable with Linda's questions about my finances, you told me I was being paranoid or holding on to grief or not giving her a fair chance. You chose not to see it because seeing it would have been inconvenient." The truth of that statement settled over the room like a weight. My uncle cleared his throat, asking what I wanted to happen next, and I outlined what my attorney had prepared: a formal legal separation of all financial ties, documented restrictions on access to any of my accounts or information, and a formal apology acknowledging the breach of trust. Linda started crying, not the delicate tears of someone genuinely remorseful, but the angry, cornered tears of someone whose careful plans had detonated in front of witnesses she'd never thought would know the truth. So here's my question for you. Have you ever had someone in your life, family, friend, partner, who made you question your own reality, who weaponized your trust so skillfully that you didn't realize you were being betrayed until the evidence was undeniable? Drop a comment below and tell me your story, because I know I'm not alone in this. Have you ever confronted someone who was exploiting you, or did you walk away quietly and carry that weight in silence? What would you have done in my situation? Would you have chosen the public exposure route, or would you have just cut contact and moved on without the confrontation? I'm genuinely curious about how other people navigate these impossible situations where protecting yourself means potentially destroying relationships that others think you should preserve at all costs. And here's the deeper question that keeps me up sometimes. When someone shows you who they really are through their actions, at what point do you stop giving them the benefit of the doubt? When does "family should forgive" become an excuse to enable bad behavior? And how do you know when you've crossed from protecting yourself into becoming the villain in someone else's story? These aren't easy answers, and I don't pretend to have them all figured out. But I do know that every time I share these experiences, someone reaches out and says, "Thank you for saying what I was afraid to admit about my own situation." So if this resonated with you, if you've lived through something similar, or you're currently in the middle of navigating a toxic family dynamic that everyone expects you to just tolerate, because that's what family does, please share your perspective. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to finally trust their own instincts. If you want more stories like this, unflinching looks at family betrayal, strategic approaches to protecting yourself from people who use love as leverage, and honest conversations about what justice actually looks like when the courts aren't involved, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. I'm not here to sugarcoat or sell you easy answers about forgiveness and moving on. I'm here to talk about the messy, complicated reality of what happens when the people who should protect you become the ones you need protection from. The next story I'm working on involves inheritance disputes, sibling rivalry that turned criminal, and a grandmother who played favorites so destructively that 3 generations are still dealing with the fallout. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. So subscribe, stay engaged, and remember that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's survival, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be victimized by people who mistake your kindness for weakness.